me on about my body, mister. Come figure it out with the Sonnet Sisters.
Hello fellows, and welcome to episode 6B of Sonnet Sisters. I'm Jennifer, and in this episode I'm going to be taking you through an analysis of sonnet number 6.
What is the meaning of this?
Now, sonnets 5 and 6 were actually written as a pair, so there's quite a few references in sonnet number 6 that refer back to things that Anna looked at last week in sonnet number 5. Okay, so as with every sonnet, I'm going to start by looking at the words that I felt I wanted to look up when I was looking at this particular poem. So first of all, distilled in line number 2 means sort of the pure essence of something that's been extracted. Similar to the process that you would go through in making perfume from flowers, which obviously is a direct reference to sonnet number 5. Now in line number 3, there was a word that was actually mistyped in my book of sonnets. Not the first time I've come across a typo in there, so maybe I should change to a different version. But vial, V-I-A-L, was misspelled as veil, V-A-I-L. Which is no wonder that I had trouble with that word when I was reading it through. So it should be vial, V-I-A-L, which is a sort of glass container, a bit like a test tube, in which you would have perhaps perfume or medicine sometimes. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, the potion, the poison that Juliet takes to make her seem as if she's asleep, usually comes in a small vial like this, a little tube that she then drinks. Now in line 5, we come across the phrase forbidden usury. Now, we came across the phrase usurer in sonnet number 4, which is sort of a negative term for a stingy moneylender. But what I didn't know about that phrase, about the term usurer, until I looked up this particular poem, was the fact that moneylending was actually seen as sinful. It was sort of okay, it was allowed if you made a 10% return, but I think no more than that was acceptable. And even if you were making that return, you still were very much looked down on, and it was not seen as a good thing at all. It was not respectful. So that makes sense of why Shakespeare uses the phrase forbidden usury, because it literally was seen as forbidden and sinful at that time to lend money and expect to get more money back for yourself as profit. It's a shame that that's not the case today. Hey, take that, banks. It's also really interesting to me, that whole thing of within usury, that it was seen as allowed in money lending if you made a 10% return. For the simple reason that throughout this poem, Shakespeare makes numerous references to 10 times something. He says, you'll be 10 times happier if you have 10 children, and they'll be 10 times happier if they then have 10 children. So there's this constant reference of 10, 10, 10, which I feel like is referenced in the term forbidden usury, and saying this is not forbidden usury because of then the references he makes to creating 10 children later on. Now in line 12, Shakespeare uses the term posterity, which kind of has a double meaning. It both means literally offspring or descendants, and also it means in perpetuity, which roughly sort of means forever. So when he says, leaving thee, living in posterity, it means both leaving you, living on through your children, through your offspring and your descendants, and it also means leaving you, living on forever. So really, again, ramping up that persuasive tone. Now, because this poem is paired with sonnet number 5, there's a lot of imagery that runs through from sonnet number 5 into this one. Mainly the images of nature and this idea of distillation, which was quite clear in sonnet number 5. And this is mostly at the beginning of sonnet number 6. And then partway through, it starts talking more about someone as a person, referring to thyself, as opposed to broadly speaking about things that happen in nature. Now again, in this poem, there's lots of positive words being used towards the subject of the poem, the person that Shakespeare is speaking to or writing for, really trying to pump up this idea that having children and procreating is a positive thing. He uses words like summer, sweet, treasure, which he says twice, happies and happier, which he also uses twice, willing, posterity, much too fair. He could have just said too fair, but he says much too fair. Like I say, really, really turning up the dial on the idea of reproducing children being a positive thing that one should want to do. Now, something that really got my attention in this poem that I want to talk about is the sort of role of women that is implied throughout this. Now, looking up the history around the time and looking up this poem, I discovered that the ideas that people had in Shakespeare's time about how children are created and contraception and pregnancy were quite different to what we know today. It seems that back at the time, a lot of people believed that all you needed to make a child was a man's seed, and that a woman was simply a place to put the seed in order for the baby to grow and then be born. And that was the end of the woman's role. The idea that the egg comes from a woman and it's a partnership between the egg and the sperm was not really something that was either known or talked about. There is this idea of a woman really being nothing more than a vessel to carry a man's seed and help that child to breed and grow. So that sort of makes sense of lines 3, 4 and 6, which all seem to refer to women indirectly, I might say, simply as a place to put his treasure, which she will happily loan him to help breed another version of him. That's also very impersonal because it could be any woman using phrases like some vial, some place, which happies those who pay the willing loan. Those? Like, who are those? It's so vague. It really could be anyone. It's like the women really don't matter. They're just a helping hand that makes the breeding happen. Which happies those who pay the willing loan also is essentially sort of saying, it's okay, the women want to lend you their bodies so that you can make a child in there. It's something that they want. And then the next line, that's for thyself, especially because the iambic beat falls on the word for, that's for thyself, is sort of saying this body and the use of this woman's body, whichever woman it happens to be, is something that is intended for you to use and to own in this way, which feels pretty problematic to me. Now, this throwaway attitude towards women and the sort of ego-boosting positive language that is used throughout, to me, gives a kind of creepy tone to the poem, particularly in line number 5, where it says, that use is not forbidden usury, which is sort of saying, hey, it's okay, this isn't sinful or illegal, which generally doesn't need to be said if something genuinely is morally sound and legal. So the very fact that he said, oh, it's not bad, makes you wonder, well, why did you feel the need to point that out? It sort of reminds me of Mephistopheles tempting Dr. Faustus, or the snake, aka the devil, tempting Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it's added to by all this ego-boosting kind of language and this suggestion of living forever, which was something that the devil did put forward in Dr. Faustus. I'm sure that's not what Shakespeare was going for, but that is how it comes across a little bit to me. And then that creepy tone is kind of solidified for me in that last line, which graphically talks about worms coming out of the subject's dead body. You don't get much creepier than that, in my opinion. There's also a weird sort of irony going on here towards the end of the poem, where we have the line, be not self-willed, sort of saying, don't be selfish here. But then throughout a lot of the poem, the tactics used to get the subject on board are talking of creating multiple versions of yourself and living on forever, which are quite egotistical notions to try and get someone on board with. So that's a really interesting contrast, telling someone not to be selfish and then telling them that they could have multiple versions of themselves that live forever. Very odd. Now, my initial response to this poem, given the slightly questionable attitudes towards women that come through to me quite clearly in the slightly creepy tone, were to suggest that these words did actually come from a man who was talking to or about a woman. So I had the idea in my head, I saw very clearly a couple of friends talking about a terrible date that one of them has just had, and she is telling her other friend the story of this date where a man said these things to her, where a man said to her, oh, you're so beautiful, don't let old age ruin your beauty, time's a ticking, you better have kids, which unfortunately is something that a lot of people do say to women. So yeah, I wanted to have two friends talking about this recounting the terrible date and the words that the man said to her, and both of them kind of sharing disgusted amazement at how misogynistic some men can be. And that still really is how the direction I'd like to go down. However, given that this sonnet is paired with sonnet number 5, I'd like to try and tie this in to Anna's sonnet number 5, which was fantastic. And so with that in mind, given what Anna did with sonnet number 5, if you haven't watched it, go back and watch it. I would then be a chirpy TV presenter back in the studio, talking still about nature, but this time talking about some species of animal that is on the brink of extinction and refusing to mate, a bit like pandas perhaps. And so I would issue a plea to the pandas in a fun, fuzzy way, maybe with a little cuddly panda, sort of personifying the pandas and trying to persuade the pandas to mate so that they don't go extinct. I think that's the only way at the moment that I can see of tying this poem into the kind of children's TV presenter thing that Anna had in the last one, talking about nature. So if I choose to tie them in together, that's probably what I'll do. But if not, then I suspect I'll go down the I had a creepy date route. But what do you think? Which of those would you choose? Or would you do something completely different? Let us know in the comments how you would film this sonnet if you were doing it. Or maybe just film it and send it in to us, and perhaps we'll show it on one of the episodes. We would love to see other people's attempts at these. Anna is going to be looking at sonnet number 7 next week, so look out for that on Monday. And of course on Saturday I will be releasing the performance version of this sonnet, so keep an eye out for that then. In the meantime, Godspeed and fare thee well.